A racist and corrupt police officer handcuffed and punched a black woman without knowing she was an FBI agent, but what happened minutes later left the entire crowd speechless, stunned, and forever changed. It was supposed to be just another warm Saturday in the city, families gathering at Lincoln Park for the annual community picnic. Kids were running, couples were laughing, a local jazz band played under the trees. The kind of event where people feel safe. Seen. Human. That was the whole point. But safety is a fragile illusion when you're black in America, even with a badge in your pocket, even when you're one of the good ones. She wasn't there for fun. She was there on assignment. Undercover. Quiet. Observing. Doing what she had trained her whole life to do, protect the people her badge swore her to serve. What she didn't expect that day was to become the target of the very abuse she was investigating. It started near the main picnic area, under the big white tent. An older black man, homeless, unshaven, alone, had approached a table asking for a plate of food. He wasn't aggressive. He wasn't demanding. Just hungry. Tired. And human. But two uniformed officers, both white, both already on edge, moved in fast. Too fast. Their hands were already on their belts before they even said a word. You could feel the tension snap in the air. People stopped chewing. The saxophone fell quiet. Parents pulled their kids back. Everyone knew that look. The look of escalation. She was about 30 feet away. Her instincts kicked in before her legs did. She walked, calm, direct, holding out her hand. Her voice was clear, steady. Officers, I need you to stand down. But that's as far as she got. Back off, lady, one of them snapped. The taller one. Broad shoulders. Bald. He looked at her like she wasn't a person, like she was a threat just for existing in that skin. You interfering with an arrest? Didn't ask for your opinion. His hand was already pushing her back. She didn't flinch. I'm asking you to lower your tone and your hands, she said. She reached into her jacket, slow and deliberate, the way law enforcement is trained to do when revealing credentials. But he didn't wait to see a badge. He didn't ask questions. He didn't pause. In one swift, violent move, he grabbed her arm, spun her around, and slammed her chest first against the hood of his cruiser. The crowd gasped. Phones came up. Children started crying. And she didn't even scream. You think you can just walk up and act like you're somebody, he growled in her ear, yanking her hands behind her back. I don't give a damn who you think you are. You're going in cuffs like everybody else. The metal bit into her wrists. She gritted her teeth. I'm a federal agent, she muttered, barely able to breathe under his weight. You just assaulted a, shut up, he barked. And then it happened. He turned her around, still cuffed, and punched her, a closed fist to her cheekbone, like she was just another problem he had to handle. Her knees buckled. The crowd roared. Someone screamed, she didn't even do anything. Another voice shouted, she showed a badge, man. But he didn't care. He stood tall. Proud. He looked around like he expected applause. But there was none. Only silence. And the quiet, electric click of every phone camera catching every second. What he didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know, was that the woman he had just humiliated, assaulted, and dragged across the pavement in front of dozens of witnesses, wasn't just any woman. She was FBI. And not just any agent. She had been sent to this exact precinct for one reason, to investigate misconduct by officers exactly like him. And this time, the whole world was watching. Because as she stood back up, bleeding, handcuffed, and calm, she didn't scream, she didn't cry. She looked him in the eye and said just one sentence, quiet but thunderous. You just ended your career. No one moved. The other officer took a step back. The supervisor on duty, late to the scene, rushed over, confusion on his face. Radios buzzed. Cameras zoomed. And in that one moment, a ripple of realization spread through the park like wildfire. Something wasn't right. Something big was about to unfold. She wasn't there by accident. She was the storm they didn't see coming. What happened next wasn't revenge. It was precision. Power. Justice. And it changed not just the officer's life, but the entire city's perception of what justice looks like when it finally shows up in a suit, with calm eyes, and a badge to match. But here's the question everyone kept asking themselves, the one that made the video go viral, the one that made national news: if she hadn't been FBI, if she had just been another black woman at a picnic, would anyone have believed her? And when she finally got the chance to speak, not as a victim, not as a statistic, but as a federal agent, what she said made the country pause. But there's one thing no one saw coming. Not the mayor. Not the police chief. Not even the agent herself. Because just minutes after that punch, after the cuffs, after the humiliation, something happened that changed everything. A twist so sharp, so poetic, it left even her breathless. So now the only question that matters is, what did she do next that shocked the entire city, and turned that day into a reckoning? Stick around. You're going to want to hear how this ends. Before we begin today's story, we want to take a moment to speak directly to every black viewer watching this video. You are seen. You are valued. You are powerful. Here at Plow of Twist, we do not tolerate racism in any form. This channel stands firmly with you, against injustice, against discrimination, and for truth and dignity. We believe stories like this must be told, not just for entertainment, but to expose, reflect, and empower. Now, sit back, take a deep breath, and prepare yourself for an emotional, dramatic journey. If you believe in justice and powerful storytelling, make sure to subscribe and hit that like button. Enjoy the story. Keisha Daniels had learned to hold her breath long before she ever wore a badge. Growing up on the south side of Richmond, Virginia, silence was often safer than speech. Her mother, a public school teacher, taught her to speak only when necessary and listen carefully, not because she lacked a voice, but because the world often decided when a black woman's voice was worthy of being heard. Her father had been a local police officer for 22 years. He left the force after a fellow officer, white and drunk, pointed a gun at him during a traffic stop and walked away with nothing but a slap on the wrist. Keisha was 13. She remembered the silence at dinner that night more than anything. Her father didn't say a word. He just looked at her and said, "Never be afraid to know more than them. That's your armor." From that moment, Keisha carried that armor everywhere. She earned top grades in school, joined debate, aced every scholarship application, and eventually walked into the FBI Academy at Quantico as one of the few, and one of the only black women, in her class. There was nothing flashy about her. She didn't care about praise. She cared about precision. About seeing the truth where others only saw stereotypes. She had learned how to blend in, observe, gather. How to hold her tongue while the world tested her patience. And that's exactly what brought her back to Richmond, years later, not as a girl with dreams, but as a federal agent with a purpose, to investigate claims of racial misconduct within the city's 8th District Police Precinct. The same precinct where her father once wore his badge. The same streets where her childhood played out between corners now patrolled by men who saw skin before they saw soul. Keisha wasn't just walking into the lion's den, she was walking into its living room, smiling, quiet, and fully aware of the danger. But the badge tucked inside her coat gave her more than legal authority. It gave her the power to protect. To change. To expose. The city hadn't changed much in her absence. The skyline had grown, the bars more polished, but the neighborhoods, her neighborhoods, still bore the same cracks. The same neglected parks. The same silent tension in the air when patrol cars cruised too slow through black communities and too fast past white ones. Richmond was a city of performance and pretense, of art galleries and gentrified cafes masking decades of division and damage. And in the middle of all that, stood Lincoln Park, one of the few public spaces where the community still gathered as one. That park was sacred ground to many, including Keisha. Her father once told her he proposed to her mother under the big oak tree near the playground. So when she was assigned to monitor Officer Brent Wallace during a community event at that very park, the symbolism wasn't lost on her. Wallace was everything Keisha had been warned about growing up. Tall. White. Loud. A man who smiled when he felt powerful and scowled when he felt challenged. Decorated for service, but whispered about in locker rooms, on bodycam reviews, and especially by the black community. He had a history, too many complaints, too few consequences. And now, he was the reason Keisha was there. Assigned to operate undercover, wearing jeans and a gray FBI shirt under her light jacket, Keisha was tasked with gathering real-time data, observing officer behavior, and, if the situation escalated, intervening within protocol. She had reviewed Wallace's file 3 times. She knew the names of the men he had arrested, and the women he had disrespected. She knew about the boy in Carver who ended up with a broken jaw and no explanation. She knew about the elderly man with dementia who ended up bruised after resisting. And she knew that Internal Affairs had buried more than one report with phrases like inconclusive and insufficient evidence. Wallace operated with the confidence of a man who knew the rules didn't apply to him. And on that sunny Saturday, with children playing tag and parents chatting over barbecue, Wallace arrived with that same smug confidence, scanning the crowd like he owned it. Keisha arrived early. She stationed herself near the food trucks, blending in, sipping lemonade and pretending to scroll her phone while noting every interaction he made. She watched him laugh with his partner, make dismissive comments to teenagers, and keep his hand just close enough to his belt to remind everyone of his authority. She didn't need to catch him doing anything illegal, just unprofessional. Just unethical. Because sometimes, those patterns painted clearer pictures than a single criminal act. But what she didn't expect, what no one could have expected, was that she wouldn't need to dig. The storm would come to her. The event was hosted by a local community outreach group, and the organizers had worked hard to make it welcoming. Volunteers wore matching t-shirts, balloons lined the tents, and the smell of grilled chicken and mac and cheese filled the air. At the far end of the park, near a shaded seating area, a man approached a table for seconds. He looked disheveled, probably homeless, but polite. The volunteers handed him a plate with a smile. But as he turned away, Wallace appeared, standing in front of him with arms crossed. The man froze. "Didn't you already eat?" Wallace asked, not as a question, but an accusation. The man, barely audible, replied, I'm hungry." "What's your name?" Wallace barked. "You got ID? You on parole? You high?" Keisha tensed. She started walking, slowly, carefully. The crowd was beginning to notice. Phones came up, quietly. A child asked his mom what was happening. The man looked cornered, confused, embarrassed. Wallace stepped closer, now with one hand on the man's shoulder. "You're trespassing on city property, sir. You need to leave." "He's not hurting anyone," a voice said firmly. Keisha had reached the group. Wallace turned. His eyes scanned her. Civilian clothes. Calm demeanor. Black woman. Dismissible. "And who the hell are you?" he asked with a dry smirk. Keisha raised one hand slightly. "Just asking you to lower the temperature. He's not violent. This is a community event." "I don't need your commentary," Wallace snapped. "Mind your business, ma'am. This is police work." Keisha didn't flinch. "And I'm asking you to de-escalate. You're escalating an already peaceful situation." Wallace stepped forward. His smile dropped. "Listen, lady. You take another step, I'll treat you like you're interfering with an arrest. Now back up. The moment cracked. Keisha knew she had seconds to either step back or stand firm. She reached into her jacket, fingers brushing the edge of her credentials. That's when it happened. Wallace shoved her back. Hard. She stumbled, not from the force, but from the shock. You're done interfering, he growled. Turn around. The crowd stirred. Phones came up higher. Someone whispered, did she just get pushed? He grabbed her arm. Pulled it behind her. Clicked cold metal around her wrist. She didn't resist, not because she couldn't, but because she wouldn't. Not yet. He pushed her against the hood of his cruiser. The crowd gasped. I told you to back off, Wallace said, his breath hot against her ear. She began, but he didn't let her finish. The punch was quick. Brutal. Her face snapped sideways. And the world froze. In that moment, everything slowed. The food, the laughter, the music, all dissolved into the sound of her breath catching in her throat. Of children asking why. Of an entire community witnessing a trauma they knew too well. She stayed down. Not because she was broken. But because she was waiting. Waiting for him to finish digging his own grave. And soon, very soon, he would. But the story doesn't end there. That punch wasn't the end, it was the beginning. Of exposure. Of reckoning. Of the kind of justice no badge could block. Because Keisha Daniels didn't just wear the badge, she was the badge. And everything that came next, would shake this city to its core. The silence that followed the punch was louder than any siren. Keisha remained still, her face turned to the side, one cheek pressed against the hood of the cruiser, the metallic taste of blood spreading in her mouth like rust. Her vision blurred, not from the pain but from the flood of emotions swelling beneath her skin, rage, humiliation, restraint, and something even deeper, control. She had trained for years to remain calm under pressure, but nothing at Quantico had prepared her for this exact kind of pain. Not physical, that she could handle. It was the sting of knowing that even with everything she had accomplished, to that man, she was still just another black woman he could brutalize without consequence. Behind her, voices began to swell. Did he really hit her? Someone murmured. She didn't even fight back. Another voice added, that's not right, man, she showed him something, she tried to tell him. Phones were out now, eyes fixed on the unfolding scene. Wallace, still riding the wave of his own authority, stood tall, scanning the crowd with a look that was no longer confident, but defensive. The energy had shifted. He felt it. A tremor of uncertainty crept into his posture as more officers arrived, including his sergeant, a wiry man named Rollins, who looked from Keisha to Wallace and immediately sensed that something had gone terribly wrong. What the hell happened here? Rollins asked sharply, stepping between them. She got in my face, Sergeant. Interfered. Aggressive. I detained her. She resisted, Wallace replied, his voice more clipped now, lacking the arrogant rhythm it held just minutes ago. She didn't resist, someone shouted from the crowd. She tried to show a badge or something, you hit her for no reason. Keisha lifted her head slowly, blood on her lip, her eyes burning into Wallace's. Sergeant, she said, her voice low and deliberate, you need to call your watch commander and internal affairs. Immediately. She didn't need to yell. The weight of her authority was embedded in every word, and for the first time, Rollins took a good look at her, the way she spoke, her demeanor, even the way she was breathing. Something didn't add up. Wallace scoffed, trying to regain control. Don't listen to her. She's trying to play you. She probably has a fake badge. These people, enough, Rollins barked. Keisha kept her eyes locked on him. Sergeant, I strongly suggest you uncuff me now and secure Officer Wallace's body cam footage before this escalates beyond your control. For a split second, Rollins hesitated. His fingers hovered near the cuffs on her wrists. "Who are you?" Keisha slowly turned her face toward him. "FBI. Internal Affairs Division. I'm embedded on a corruption probe targeting misconduct in this precinct. Everything that's happened here has been recorded." A collective gasp rose from the crowd. Wallace's face paled. The sergeant's hand dropped. But Keisha didn't move. She wasn't ready yet. The performance had to be complete. Every second that passed made the silence louder, and that silence became evidence. In the following minutes, everything shifted into motion, slow, nervous, fragmented. Rollins ordered the cuffs removed. Keisha stood tall, eyes forward, wiping the blood from her lip with the sleeve of her jacket. The crowd didn't cheer, didn't scream, they just watched. Tension pressed on every ribcage. Keisha looked at the other officers, scanning their faces. Some looked away. One younger officer, maybe 24 at most, mouthed, "I'm sorry," before stepping back into the formation. She'd remember him. Not because of his apology, but because he understood that something irreversible had just happened. She turned toward Wallace. His stance was shaky now. His hands twitched slightly. "This ain't over," he muttered under his breath. "You set me up." Keisha leaned in close, not to threaten, but to deliver a truth he couldn't unhear. "You did this to yourself. You saw my skin before you saw my badge. Now let's see who answers for that." Rollins called for a full incident report, and Keisha, composed despite the bruising, was escorted to a temporary medical tent where EMTs cleaned her face. She declined a hospital visit, she needed to stay on site. She needed them all to see her still standing. Not a victim. Not broken. Just alert, awake, and documenting every reaction. The whispers began to move faster than the music could return. Parents began pulling their children away from officers, even the ones who hadn't done anything. The atmosphere had soured. What was once a celebration of unity had turned into a living indictment of the system. And that was exactly the wound Keisha had come to expose. Only now, it wasn't just data. It was personal. Visceral. As she sat on the edge of the medical tent, sipping water through a cracked lip, she called her supervisor. The conversation was brief, but loaded. "Stay put," he told her. "We're pulling the body cam footage now. Don't confront him again. Let the system catch up to the damage." But she knew better. The system didn't catch up. It tripped, stalled, hesitated. If you wanted it to move, you had to push. Hard. Later that evening, as the event wound down and officers returned to the precinct, Keisha walked through the building with quiet defiance. Her presence unsettled the atmosphere. Conversations halted. Eyes darted. Some whispered. Others watched from corners. Wallace wasn't there, he had been pulled aside for review, pending the internal inquiry. But Keisha knew that wouldn't be enough. Public outrage was already stirring online. The video had spread, a 15-second clip showing a black woman being punched, bleeding, then calmly revealing her status as an FBI agent. No hashtags yet. But they were coming. And with them, a reckoning. She entered the conference room where a folder sat waiting, her case file, thick with evidence from prior complaints. Patterns. Narratives. Stories no one wanted to believe. Until now. She placed a copy of the incident report inside. Then, she added something else, her own handwritten statement. Not as a formality. But as a declaration. Moments later, the door creaked open. Rollins stepped inside. "You're blowing this up bigger than it needs to be," he said quietly. "We can handle this internally." He didn't know who you were. "That's exactly the problem," Keisha said, not even looking up. "Why should that matter?" He paused, hands in his pockets. "Do you have any idea what this could do to the department?" "Yes," she answered without hesitation. Maybe it's time it finally happens. She stood, collected her things, and moved toward the exit. The hallway was long and still. And somewhere, down the corridor, she could hear murmurs, some voices tense, others indignant. It was happening. The machine had started to turn. But even then, Keisha knew this wasn't over. She could feel it in her bones. Something was coming. Something bigger. Because men like Wallace didn't go down without a fight, and somewhere, behind closed doors, he was already preparing one. And when he made his next move, he'd regret it. Because Keisha wasn't the same woman he cuffed that afternoon. She was ready. And what she was about to do next, no one saw coming. The precinct was quiet in a way that didn't feel normal. Not the usual late-night hush of paperwork and shift changes, but a stillness that pulsed beneath every fluorescent flicker, heavy, waiting. Keisha walked slowly through the corridor, her shoes tapping against the tile with a rhythm that echoed through every corner. She wasn't in uniform. She didn't need it. Her presence now carried something heavier than a title, it carried a storm. The kind that didn't come with thunder, but with revelation. She'd spent the last 48 hours collecting. Not just footage and statements, but truths. Testimonies. Internal emails. Redacted reports that suddenly looked very different in the light of what had happened in that park. She had backup now, not just from the FBI, but from a growing number of voices outside the building. The community wasn't just angry, it was awake. And Wallace, he hadn't said a word publicly. But behind closed doors, word was he was pressing for a defense. Misidentification. Provocation. The usual lines. But this time, Keisha wasn't just one woman in the room. She had a spotlight behind her, and Wallace had nowhere to hide. She stopped outside the internal review room. Inside, the department's command staff sat around the long table. Tension radiated through the walls. The door opened without ceremony, and she stepped in. All eyes shifted toward her, not with greeting, but with anticipation. They'd seen the video. They knew what she represented now. Not just evidence, but consequence. Captain Harlan, a square-jawed man with 30 years behind a desk and a reputation for keeping scandals out of the press, cleared his throat. Agent Daniels. You requested this briefing. She nodded once, no small talk. Yes, I did. There was no podium. No PowerPoint. Just her voice and the weight of what she carried. She placed a flash drive on the table, looked at Harlan, and said, "Play the clip." The screen flickered on, and for a moment, the room was bathed in silence. Then the footage played, not the shaky cell phone video, but the high-definition bodycam footage from Wallace's chest. Every detail. Every word. His aggression. Her calm. His strike. Her restraint. It was all there. But what none of them had heard until now, was the audio after the moment he punched her. The part that hadn't been on social media. The silence in the room cracked open as they heard Wallace's voice, low, caught by the mic. That's what happens when these people forget who's in charge. I don't care who she says she is. The phrase hung in the air like smoke. No one moved. No one dared speak. Keisha let it breathe for a moment. Then she looked directly at the captain. He knew. He didn't care. And now, you do. Harlan's jaw tightened. We're conducting a full investigation. That's not enough, she cut in, her tone sharper now. This isn't just about me. This is about every report your department buried. Every victim that never got a chance to speak. Every officer who stayed silent while Wallace dragged your badge through the mud. And now, I'm not asking you to act. I'm demanding it. There was a rustle at the door. Wallace entered, flanked by 2 union reps. He looked different. Less composed. Paler. As if the armor he'd worn for years, the smug confidence, the untouchable aura, had started to crack. His eyes met hers. For a moment, the room dissolved. Just the two of them. A stare-down years in the making. Agent Daniels, one of the reps said, a woman in a gray suit, we'd appreciate it if you refrain from making further accusations until Officer Wallace has had a chance to. Keisha didn't look away. He doesn't get to speak first. Not this time. Wallace tried to lean forward, voice low and firm. You set me up. She tilted her head slightly. You set yourself up the moment you put your hands on me without asking a single question. He scoffed. You think just because you work for the feds, you can come in here and, I think, she said, stepping toward him slowly, that I've spent my entire career holding back, waiting for the system to do the right thing. And now I realize, the system isn't broken. It's working exactly the way people like you want it to. But not anymore. The room fell into stillness again. No one interrupted. No one defended him. Harlan finally broke the silence. Officer Wallace, he said coldly, you're being placed on immediate administrative leave, pending termination review. Your badge and weapon, now. Wallace froze. His mouth opened, then closed. The union rep stood still, silent now. He reached for his belt slowly, unhooked his badge, and laid it on the table. The room watched, no one speaking. Then his sidearm. Clunk. Silence again. Keisha didn't smile. This wasn't victory. Not yet. She turned to leave, but Wallace's voice came again, softer, almost wounded. You don't get it. You think this'll fix anything? You think this'll change the way they look at you out there? She stopped at the door, turned halfway. No, she said, voice low. But maybe it'll change the way they look at you. She walked out without waiting for a response. The hallway was still. Outside the precinct, the sun had started to rise. Her phone buzzed, an alert. The video had hit national media. News outlets were swarming. The story was out. But what no one knew yet, not the public, not the officers, not even the captain, was what Keisha had submitted in a sealed report to her supervisors hours earlier. Because that punch, that was just the beginning. Buried inside the precinct servers, under layers of bureaucratic fog, she had found something bigger. Something that connected Wallace to a pattern of falsified arrests, altered reports, and quiet payouts. Victims who had been coerced into silence. Families who had been told their loved ones were uncooperative, when in truth, they were targets. It was never just about her. It was a system, and Wallace was only the first crack. As she reached her car, Keisha paused for a moment, staring into the rearview mirror. Her reflection stared back, not bruised, not broken, but ready. The real storm hadn't even started yet. And the next move would flip the whole department on its head. The morning air was heavy with anticipation, thick with the kind of tension that could only come before something irreversible. Keisha sat in the back seat of an unmarked government vehicle parked just outside the downtown courthouse. The engine hummed quietly beneath her, the soft whir of air conditioning competing with the sound of her breath. She was dressed sharply, her face carefully made up to conceal the fading bruise on her cheek. But no powder could hide the weight in her eyes. The sealed report she delivered the night before had detonated quietly behind closed doors, and now the fallout was beginning. She knew the moment she stepped into that building, things wouldn't go back to the way they were. Not for the department. Not for the city. Not for her. She didn't move until she got the text, "Press is assembling. Clock's ticking. Let's go." It was from James Calder, the deputy director assigned to oversee the investigation after her report exposed more than just a rogue officer. It was never just about Wallace. The punch was the spark, but what Keisha had uncovered in her late-night search through encrypted case files, hidden payment logs, and sealed settlements revealed a network of complicity, officers falsifying statements, supervisors erasing complaints, and internal reviews that read more like scripted defenses than justice. She stepped out of the car with her chin high. The courthouse steps were swarming now, reporters setting up their cameras, microphones trembling in the breeze, officers standing in defensive clusters by the entrance. Some of them knew her. Some avoided her eyes. All of them knew the narrative was no longer in their control. Inside, the press conference was already underway. Calder stood at the podium, face tight with focus, the seal of the Department of Justice behind him. He didn't waste words. Today we are announcing the launch of a federal civil rights investigation into the Richmond 8th District Police Precinct. Evidence suggests a pattern of systemic misconduct, abuse of power, and deliberate suppression of public accountability. He paused, letting that sink in before continuing. This began with one moment. A single act of violence against a federal agent. But what we found goes far beyond that. Keisha remained silent, standing to the side, eyes scanning the room. Then Calder motioned toward her. Agent Daniels will be leading the liaison task force during this process. Her report brought these truths to light. And her voice, her presence, has reminded us all of what accountability truly looks like. Cameras flashed as Keisha stepped forward. She didn't look down at notes. She didn't need them. I didn't come here to be a symbol, she began, her voice steady. I came here to investigate a pattern. What I didn't expect was to become part of it. What happened to me at Lincoln Park wasn't an isolated incident. It was a reflection. And what we found behind that reflection was a mirror none of us can look away from anymore. She paused as murmurs rippled through the room. Her eyes met those of one young reporter, his brow furrowed not with skepticism, but with a kind of stunned clarity. I want to speak now to the people who filed reports and never heard back, to the families who were told their loved ones were resisting, and to every voice that was silenced inside a precinct designed to protect them. I see you. And I will not stop until you are seen by everyone else too. After the conference ended, the day moved in a blur. Meetings with the DOJ team, briefings, strategy discussions. And still, something gnawed at her, a missing piece. Wallace hadn't made a public statement, but a confidential memo had reached her earlier that morning. He'd retained private legal counsel, and rumors swirled that he intended to go on national television with his own version of the story. A counterattack. A weaponized plea. The thought twisted in her chest, not from fear, but from the sheer audacity. Late that afternoon, as sunlight poured across her office desk, her phone rang. Unknown number. She hesitated, then answered. His voice was quieter than she remembered, stripped of bluster. Agent Daniels. It's Brent Wallace. The name alone made her pulse flicker. I don't expect you to talk to me, he said. But I need you to hear me. I'm being pushed to go public. They're saying I should say I panicked, say I was under stress. That I didn't know. That it was the heat of the moment. But none of that's true. And you know it. Keisha didn't respond at first. Then finally, she said, why are you really calling me? He exhaled. Because it's starting to sink in. What I did. What I said. What I let myself become in that uniform. She waited, cautious. I watched the video, he said, voice breaking slightly. Not just mine. The ones from the crowd. The way you looked at me when I hit you. You didn't flinch. You didn't beg. You just took it. Like you'd been hit by the system before. Keisha swallowed hard, trying not to let the words drag her backward. You didn't deserve that, Wallace said. You're right, she answered quietly. I'm not asking for forgiveness, he added. I know that's not mine to ask for. But I need you to know I'm not going on TV to lie. I'm going to tell the truth. Even if it destroys me. Keisha felt something shift. Not sympathy. But gravity. You should, she said. But not for me. For every person you hurt that no one recorded. The call ended, and the silence it left behind felt sacred. The next morning, Wallace stood in front of a local news camera. No uniform. No script. Just a man unraveling the myth of his own authority. He admitted to the punch. To the racial bias. To manipulating reports. He even admitted that on the day he attacked her, he knew who she was 5 seconds before he struck. He just didn't care. I thought I was untouchable, he said. And now, I'm not. And I don't want anyone else to be either. The city exploded. Protests surged not with violence, but with unified purpose. Investigations widened. Charges were filed. And Keisha, she didn't hide. She walked through the neighborhood she was once told to avoid, listened to the stories, sat on porches with grandmothers who cried and young men who finally felt seen. She testified before the city council. Before Congress. Her name became synonymous with courage, but she never let it change her. One evening, weeks later, as the sun dipped low over Richmond, she sat across from her father on the back porch of their childhood home. You did what I couldn't, he said, his voice rough with pride. You did more than enough, she replied. You showed me the way. I just followed it louder. He chuckled softly, then fell into silence. After a moment, he looked at her and said, Do you think it'll really change things? She stared into the horizon, the weight of everything behind her and everything still ahead. I think it already has, she said. But we've still got a long way to go. And deep down, she knew, what had started with handcuffs would end with something far greater, accountability. And the legacy of that single moment in Lincoln Park would echo through generations. The aftermath of Brent Wallace's televised confession moved through Richmond like an earthquake. It wasn't loud in the way riots or sirens might be, but it was deep, disruptive, and unmistakably real. People didn't shout, they whispered differently. Walked differently. Looked at the uniform differently. The image of a decorated officer admitting to racial misconduct on camera wasn't just news, it was a rupture in the narrative many had clung to for comfort or denial. Suddenly, conversations that had been brushed aside for years were now unignorable. The city was split open, and truth, no longer buried under politics and PR statements, was spilling into every crack of the public consciousness. Keisha found herself at the center of something far more complex than she ever anticipated. The media attention had elevated her status to near iconic levels. She was being hailed as a symbol of justice, resilience, and change. But with that visibility came scrutiny. Every move she made was watched. Every word analyzed. There were emails from journalists asking for exclusives, calls from activist groups wanting her to speak at rallies, invitations from networks hoping to feature her in primetime specials. But there was something inside her, an old ache rooted in the very same silence she'd grown up with, that made her hesitate. She hadn't done this for praise. She had done it because the system had failed, and she refused to be another person who watched it happen without fighting back. And yet, in becoming the face of a reckoning, she had to carry not only her own pain, but the collective weight of others who had been broken long before her. Behind closed doors, the federal task force was moving swiftly. Evidence pulled from Keisha's report led to the immediate suspension of 4 additional officers, including a lieutenant known for orchestrating most of the internal cover-ups. Files were unsealed. Testimonies reopened. Civil suits flooded the court system, many of them detailing incidents that mirrored patterns long dismissed as isolated events. The city council had no choice but to act. Public hearings were scheduled. Protesters gathered not in anger, but in expectation. People weren't demanding vengeance. They wanted truth. Recognition. They wanted to be heard. Yet, as the investigation unfolded, Keisha encountered a dilemma she hadn't prepared for. One of the names buried deep in the documentation, a name attached to doctored reports and forged signatures, was someone she knew. Someone who had mentored her father back in the day. Officer Lewis Green. Retired now, but still revered by the community. A black man. A man who had once stood for change when few dared to speak. His name on those files was more than a red flag, it was a betrayal. And it made everything murkier. This wasn't a simple battle between good and evil, white and black, corrupt and pure. It was tangled, layered, human. It meant some people who wore her skin color also played a part in keeping others down. Keisha struggled with the decision to expose him. Green had attended her high school graduation. He'd once bought her ice cream when her father couldn't make it to a school event. He was part of her past, part of the very reason she believed in the possibility of reform. But his signature, undeniably present on falsified arrest forms, tied him to practices that had destroyed lives. She stared at the evidence for hours one night, alone in her apartment, with the city skyline shimmering in the distance. Every part of her training told her what to do. But every part of her heart told her to pause. The next day, she scheduled a private meeting with him. No cameras. No wires. Just two people on opposite sides of a painful truth. They sat on a bench near Bird Park, under the shade of a maple tree whose branches curled like quiet fingers above their heads. Green, now in his late 60s, looked older than she remembered. His eyes, once sharp, were dimmed by years and regrets. He didn't pretend not to know why she had called him. He simply looked at her, then nodded. "You saw the reports," he said, voice thin. "I saw your name," Keisha replied, her words measured. He exhaled deeply, hands folded on his lap. "You want to know why? I get it. I don't want excuses," she said, "I want truth." He nodded again, slower this time. "It started small. You tell yourself it's just paperwork. Just smoothing out rough edges so nobody gets jammed up. You justify it because you think the ends justify the means. You think if you're keeping someone dangerous off the street, it's okay to tweak the story a little. Then one day, someone asks you to look the other way. And you do. Because the guy asking is someone you trust. Then it's not about justice anymore. It's about loyalty. About keeping your brothers safe. And that's the poison, Keisha. It doesn't hit all at once. It drips. Quietly. She listened without interrupting. Not because she forgave him, but because she needed to hear it. The infection wasn't just in policies or procedures. It was in the culture. In silence. In the slow erosion of integrity. "I never laid a hand on anyone," Green added. "But I let others do it. And I stayed quiet. And that makes me guilty." Keisha looked at him, her heart heavy. "You were the reason I believed this could change. You were the reason I joined." "I know," he said softly. "And that's what breaks me." She stood, not out of anger, but because she couldn't sit any longer. The weight was too much. "I have to include your name in the report. I can't protect you." He nodded. "You shouldn't." As she walked away, her feet felt heavier with every step. Not because of guilt. But because the reality of what it meant to hold people accountable was finally sinking in. Justice wasn't clean. It wasn't satisfying. It wasn't revenge. It was layered with pain, and it often came at the cost of people we once trusted. Back at headquarters, the final report was nearly complete. Her supervisor, Calder, called her into his office, voice tight. "We're preparing the findings for public release. I need to know, are you ready for the backlash?" Keisha nodded slowly. "It's not about readiness. It's about necessity." He looked at her, a trace of something like admiration passing across his expression. "This isn't just going to change this city, Keisha. This is going to change how departments across the country operate. We'll take hits. You'll take hits. I've already been hit," she said, her voice level. "Now it's time they feel it too." Outside, the city buzzed, alive with the energy of transformation. Murals had gone up. Poems scribbled on alley walls. Street corners renamed in memory of those who had suffered unseen. Richmond was breathing differently now. But Keisha knew this wasn't the end. Change was never a destination. It was a cycle. And she was part of it now, not just as a symbol, but as a catalyst. As she walked through the corridor toward her office, her phone buzzed again. A message from a victim's family thanking her. Another from a community organizer asking to meet. And another, from a young black girl in high school, saying she wanted to be just like her. That one made her stop in her tracks. She closed her eyes, let the message sink in, then whispered to herself, not as an agent, but as a woman who had bled, who had stood back up, and who had made a choice not to break. Not like me, she said quietly. Better. And somewhere deep inside, she felt it again, that calm before the next storm. But this time, she wouldn't be walking into it alone. The days that followed moved with a strange rhythm, a combination of national headlines and quiet personal reckonings. Keisha found herself existing in two worlds at once. On one side, the public face of reform, speaking to networks and agencies, attending briefings and preparing for the formal release of her findings. On the other, a woman who had to carry the emotional wreckage of everything she had unearthed. She would wake up in the middle of the night with Green's voice still echoing in her head, his guilt unraveling like a slow confession stitched into her conscience. The city had started to see her as a beacon, but she felt more like a mirror, reflecting all the things no one wanted to confront. One morning, as she sat alone in her office reviewing the final edits on the Justice Department's press package, her phone buzzed with a name she hadn't seen in years, Vanessa Richards. A journalist she had gone to college with, someone known for her integrity, but also for digging deeper than most were comfortable with. Keisha hesitated before answering, but finally pressed the call button. Vanessa didn't waste time. Keisha, I'm calling you not as press, but as someone who respects what you've done. I need to ask you something off record. Keisha leaned back in her chair, already feeling the weight of whatever was coming. Go ahead. I've been doing my own digging. You're not the only one who had eyes on that precinct. There are people whispering about a confidential file. Something that implicates not just officers, but city officials. Evidence that decisions were made above Wallace's head. Cover-ups. Approvals. Did you find anything like that? Keisha didn't answer immediately. Her eyes fell on the top drawer of her desk, locked, but burning with significance. That drawer held a USB drive. One she hadn't turned in yet. One containing records that pointed not just to rogue officers, but to a chain of command that extended into the mayor's office. It was information she hadn't shared with the task force yet because she knew the scale of what it could unleash. Vanessa's voice softened. If it's real, Keisha, this could shake the entire state. Keisha finally spoke. It's real. But it's dangerous. If this goes public now, it could stall everything we've been building. People will panic. They'll weaponize it. It'll be chaos. But if it's true, Vanessa said, don't people deserve to know? Keisha closed her eyes. The question sat between them like a loaded weapon. She had come this far to expose corruption, but how deep was she willing to go? And at what cost? Later that afternoon, she met with Calder to review the strategy for the federal rollout. His tone was crisp, clinical, as he laid out the media approach and legal boundaries. But Keisha noticed a shift in his posture when she mentioned Vanessa's call. She saw it in the way his jaw tensed, the way his fingers stopped drumming the desk. There's a bigger game at play here, Agent Daniels, he said carefully. If we name names without airtight confirmation, the whole investigation risks being discredited. We don't win that way. Keisha didn't flinch. But if we don't name them, they stay protected. That's not justice. That's performance. He looked at her, and for a moment, the professionalism cracked. Do you trust me? She didn't answer right away. Because trust wasn't simple anymore. That night, Keisha sat on the edge of her bed, laptop open, the USB drive between her fingers. Her apartment was dark except for the soft glow from the screen. Outside, the city hummed, unaware of the storm she held in her hand. She thought of her mother, of how she used to say, "Truth isn't a clean blade, baby, it cuts both ways." And she felt that cut now, deep and uncertain. She opened the file. Names. Emails. Transaction logs. A meeting transcript where a senior city official ordered an investigation to be dissolved quietly. There was no more denying it. Richmond's rot ran deeper than anyone wanted to admit. Then came a knock at her door. It was Officer Malik Price, the young patrolman who had mouthed, "I'm sorry," at Lincoln Park. He looked anxious, eyes darting behind him as if afraid of being seen. Keisha stepped aside, letting him in without a word. "I need to talk," he said, breathless. "I've kept quiet too long." She watched him carefully as he sat across from her. He looked younger than he had that day. Or maybe he was just less guarded now. "There's more," he said. "More than what you've already found. I have copies. Logs. Bodycam archives that were deleted from our servers, but I saved them. They show officers planting evidence. Intimidating witnesses. Some of them didn't even know their cams were still on. I didn't know who to give them to, until now." Keisha felt the air shift. This wasn't just a crack in the wall anymore. It was collapse. He pulled a drive from his pocket and placed it on the table. "I believe in what you're doing," he said. "But they'll come after you. All of them. They're not gonna go down easy." Keisha nodded slowly. "Neither am I." The next morning, she requested a private meeting with the Department of Justice's executive liaison. She laid everything out, Price's drive, the hidden city files, Green's confession. Everything. She didn't sugarcoat any of it. She made one demand, that the entire network be brought into the light. That this investigation wasn't about one officer, but about a system that had treated accountability like a threat instead of a promise. The liaison listened. Carefully. Then he said, "If we do this, there's no undoing it. You'll lose friends. Your name will be dragged. There may be political retaliation." Keisha looked him in the eye. "Then let it come." The final report was amended. Names added. Dates confirmed. Cross-referenced and watertight. The DOJ prepared its statement. And Keisha, now fully aware of what was at stake, stood ready. But before it was released, she made one final visit, to the family of the homeless man who had been harassed in Lincoln Park that day. His name was Clarence Bennett. A veteran. Schizophrenic. Forgotten. But not anymore. She sat with his sister, a woman named Alma, who served her tea in chipped porcelain mugs and wept as she held Keisha's hand. "You gave him dignity," Alma whispered. "Even after everything." Keisha blinked back tears. "I couldn't stop what happened to him. But I can make sure it doesn't happen to someone else." They sat in silence for a while, letting grief and gratitude share the same space. Then Keisha stood and hugged her tightly, the kind of hug that didn't fix anything but meant everything. As she walked out into the fading light of day, her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from Calder. "Press release scheduled for tomorrow morning. Buckle up." Keisha stared out at the city as it glowed under the last rays of sunset. She wasn't afraid anymore. She wasn't uncertain. And she wasn't alone. What started as one act of violence had become a movement. And that movement was about to rewrite the story of Richmond forever. The morning of the federal release came cloaked in an eerie calm. The kind that settles just before everything shifts. Keisha stood in front of her bathroom mirror, adjusting the collar of her blazer with slow, practiced movements, the weight of the day settling into her shoulders like a second skin. Her eyes met their own reflection, still, fierce, exhausted. Behind them, sleepless nights and the hum of a truth too loud to ignore. Her phone buzzed from the bedroom, vibrating on the edge of the nightstand. It was Calder. It's live, the message read. They're all watching. Outside, the city of Richmond stirred into motion as usual, unaware of how deeply its roots were about to be shaken. But inside government buildings, on courtroom benches, in households across communities that had long whispered about injustices no one ever proved, people were tuning in. Screens flickered on in classrooms, diners, living rooms, police precincts. The broadcast began with a seal and a silence. Then Calder appeared behind a podium, the press seated before him like a jury. But this wasn't about performance anymore. This was about truth. And behind him, standing tall and centered, was Keisha. He didn't introduce her. He didn't need to. Her name had already become synonymous with the investigation. Instead, he opened with facts, systemic misconduct, cover-ups, complicity at multiple levels. He named names. The audience froze with each syllable. He named Green. He named the deputy mayor. He listed off cases buried under years of administrative fog. Then came the statement of action: federal indictments were being issued. A sweeping reform task force would be installed to oversee structural change in Richmond's law enforcement systems. And the woman who had lit the match, who had risked everything, was now being assigned to lead it. When Keisha stepped forward, the room held its breath. She didn't speak like someone seeking revenge. Her voice was controlled, her tone deliberate, each word shaped by the journey that had led her to this podium. She didn't smile. This wasn't a victory lap. It was a reckoning. I didn't want to become the face of this, she began, her voice reverberating across the hall. I wanted to do my job, quietly, thoroughly. But silence has protected too many for too long. And when the law becomes a shield for the oppressor instead of a sword for the oppressed, then silence becomes complicity. She paused, letting the tension settle before pushing further. What we uncovered in Richmond was not an anomaly. It was not the result of one bad officer. It was a system. One that knew how to hide itself. One that relied on intimidation, misinformation, and the unwillingness of others to confront uncomfortable truths. But the truth doesn't need permission to be real. And now, it's out. Afterward, she didn't stick around for the applause. There was work to do. As she left the building, flanked by federal agents and DOJ representatives, the press shouted questions, cameras flashing, people reaching out to touch the woman who had forced the city to look in the mirror. But Keisha didn't respond. Her mind was already in the next room, the next decision, the next battle. Later that afternoon, she returned to the precinct, not as an investigator, but as the newly assigned federal oversight director. A temporary title. But one with full authority. Officers stood when she walked in. Some avoided her gaze. Others nodded in silent acknowledgement. One woman, a rookie barely out of academy, offered a tight smile. "Ma'am," she said. Keisha nodded back. That was all. But it was enough. The silence that once whispered of fear now hinted at a shift. She entered the captain's office. Harlan was gone, retired under pressure, his name etched into the final report as a man who failed to act in the face of known misconduct. In his place stood interim Chief Morales, a Latina officer with 2 decades of service and a reputation for doing the right thing, even when it wasn't easy. Morales extended a hand. "Welcome back," she said, her tone neutral but respectful. Keisha shook it firmly. "Thank you. I'm not here to clean up for the sake of appearances. I'm here to change the floorboards." Morales smiled faintly. "Good. Because this place doesn't need a coat of paint. It needs demolition." They got to work. Files reopened. Policies dismantled. Officers reassigned or placed under review. New hires brought in with clear psychological assessments and community approval processes. Bodycams audited in real time by civilian panels. And perhaps most symbolically, Lincoln Park, once the site of a public humiliation, was now the ground for weekly town halls, where officers and citizens sat face to face without uniforms, without rank, just people sharing space, sharing pain, and slowly rebuilding trust. But not everything was met with applause. Threats arrived in Keisha's inbox daily, anonymous voicemails, thinly veiled messages about how, "This isn't how we do things down here." People on city payroll who had lost power began to push back in whispers, in delayed forms, in subtle obstruction. And there were moments, late nights at her desk, alone with piles of testimony, when the weight felt unbearable. One such night, as rain pattered against her office window, Keisha heard a knock. It was Officer Price. He held a thick manila envelope. "I found this buried in an archive labeled, 'Closed Investigations,'" he said, setting it down. "It's a list of civilian complaints that were never logged. Almost all black residents. Some of them are dead now. Some are still waiting for justice." Keisha opened the envelope slowly. Page after page. Names. Dates. Allegations. None resolved. Some spanning back more than a decade. She looked up at him. "Why didn't anyone say anything?" "They tried," Price said, his voice low. "But they were tired of screaming into a void." She sat back, overwhelmed by the sheer volume of pain laid bare in front of her. Then she looked at Price, who stood there, waiting. "You did the right thing coming here," she said. "Thank you." He hesitated. "You think we can fix this?" Keisha didn't answer right away. Instead, she picked up one of the names, Tamara Jones, 17, accused of resisting arrest while walking home. Charges dropped. No apology. "I think we can make sure it doesn't happen again," she finally said. And maybe that's where healing starts. That weekend, she visited Tamara's mother, who still lived in the same one-bedroom apartment in Hillside. They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Tamara had done her homework the night before she was slammed onto the hood of a squad car for asking why she was being stopped. "She never wanted money," the woman said softly, her fingers wrapped around a mug of tea. "She just wanted someone to say they were sorry." Keisha leaned forward. "Then that's where we'll begin." She took out a formal statement, signed by the department, acknowledging the harm, apologizing publicly, and offering Tamara the option to sit down with those who wronged her, on her terms. "This won't undo what happened," Keisha said, her voice steady. "But it might be the first brick in a new foundation." Tamara's mother reached for her hand. "You're not like them." Keisha looked her in the eye. "I used to want to be. Now I just want to be better." And that was the truth. Not just about justice, but about transformation. A city was changing, not all at once, not cleanly, but undeniably. And the woman who started it all stood not above it, not outside it, but in the thick of it, bruised, relentless, and still rising. 6 months later, Richmond was no longer the same city it had been. The air still carried the same southern humidity, the same music from corner stores and church choirs, but something deeper had shifted. The conversations had changed. The looks between officers and residents no longer carried the same guarded fear, but a cautious acknowledgement that maybe, just maybe, their voices could finally matter. Keisha walked through Lincoln Park again, but this time there were no uniforms circling the perimeter, no tension pulsing beneath the surface. Children ran freely. Elders sat laughing on benches beneath the oaks. And on the stage, where she had once stood bruised and silent, now stood community leaders sharing stories, dreams, and plans. The park had become a symbol, not of pain, but of what could rise from it. For Brent Wallace, the consequences had come quickly and without room for negotiation. After his public admission, federal charges were filed for civil rights violations and falsification of records. His plea deal required not just a conviction, but active cooperation in the investigation against other officers and city officials. In court, he stood visibly smaller, the fire long gone from his eyes, and offered no defense, only a statement. "I saw myself as the law, but I forgot I was supposed to serve it." I failed. And I will carry that failure forever. His sentence included prison time, but also a mandate for restorative justice sessions with victims' families, a decision that sparked controversy, but also conversation. He was no longer a symbol of power. He had become a symbol of consequence. Officer Lewis Green, after weeks of silence, chose to speak publicly. At a town hall attended by hundreds, he took the microphone not to defend himself, but to name his role in the system that had silenced so many. His voice cracked as he described the years of compromise, the way he let fear of losing his badge outweigh his responsibility to the people. I thought staying in the room meant I could change the room, he said. But I never opened the door for anyone else to walk in. That was my mistake. He retired from public life, but began volunteering in community mentorship programs, helping train a new generation of officers in ethics, empathy, and accountability. He would never erase his part in the damage, but he had chosen to spend the rest of his days trying to prevent it from happening again. Officer Malik Price, the young patrolman who once stood silent in the face of injustice, became one of the youngest members ever appointed to the Community Oversight Board. His willingness to speak out had come at a cost, whispers among colleagues, cold shoulders, but in time, his courage inspired others. Recruits began looking up to him not just for his integrity, but for his clarity in choosing what was right, even when it was difficult. At one of the board's first meetings, he looked around at the diverse panel of citizens, survivors, and officers, and said, "We can't undo the past, but we can decide what kind of future we're building, brick by brick, policy by policy." As for Keisha Daniels, her life had changed more than anyone could have imagined. The case had taken her from quiet agent to national figure, from an observer of injustice to a force that redefined how justice could be served. Offers poured in, academic institutions wanted her as a lecturer, media outlets chased interviews, government agencies proposed positions of power. But Keisha didn't chase prestige. She chose presence. She stayed in Richmond, accepted a permanent position as director of the newly established Department of Civil Accountability, and built a team grounded in lived experience and community voices. Her work became not just about policy, but about healing. She started initiatives to reunite wrongfully convicted families, partnered with local schools to introduce justice education programs, and founded a leadership incubator for young black girls called the Armor Project, a nod to her father's old advice. One evening, months after the last hearing closed, Keisha visited her father's grave. The sky was painted in deep indigo, stars pushing their way through the dusk. She knelt beside the headstone, fingers brushing the cold stone as if trying to transfer the weight of everything she had carried. "You told me to be smarter than them," she whispered, "but you never told me how heavy it would be." She stayed there in silence for a long time, letting the wind speak back to her. When she rose to leave, she wasn't lighter. But she was rooted. And that was enough. Richmond streets didn't forget what they had been. But they no longer pretended. Murals of lives once dismissed now stood proudly on city walls. Former precinct buildings had been converted into public centers. And in one of the most surprising twists of all, the very precinct where Keisha was once assaulted became the new headquarters for the Community Justice Department, rebuilt, redesigned, and renamed in honor of change. People didn't forget. But they forgave. Slowly. Carefully. And still, even as change began to bloom, Keisha never allowed herself to believe it was done. In her office, above her desk, she kept a framed quote that read, "Justice is not a moment. It is a movement." Because she understood what too many forget, victories are not endings. They are invitations to keep pushing, to keep questioning, to keep showing up even when the applause fades and the cameras turn away. And now, to you, the listener, the witness, the one who sat through this story from the very beginning, what would you have done in Keisha's place? Could you have stayed calm, steady, and fearless in the face of humiliation? Could you have held the line, knowing that justice might cost you your peace, your reputation, even your safety? What does justice look like to you, not on paper, but in your daily choices? And if you were forced to choose between protecting someone you love and confronting a truth that could destroy them, which path would you take? This story isn't just fiction. It is a reflection of systems that exist, of people who remain unseen, of strength that is often quiet, patient, and unstoppable. If this story moved you, challenged you, made you feel something real, then share it. Talk about it. Don't let the conversation end when the screen fades to black. And if you want to hear more stories like this, true to life, full of twist, truth, and transformation, then subscribe to Tales of Twist. Hit that like button, join the conversation in the comments, and let us know, what would you have done if justice had your name on it? We'll see you in the next story.